my younger sibling, Jess, who's non-binary and uses they, he pronouns, just for the sake of the conversation, was doing a college internship in New York when I was sort of fresh out of grad school. And I had this tiny 200 square foot studio that was basically like a long hallway with a kitchen at the end of it. I couldn't fit a full bed in the apartment. So I had a trundle bed, like a day bed with a trundle underneath. And they had student housing in Brooklyn. Like days into arriving at the student housing, realized there was mold in the student housing, and my sibling has chronic idiopathic urticaria, which is chronic hives, basically. And I was like, okay, come over. You'll stay here for a weekend. We'll figure it out. And they showed up with a bunch of suitcases and stayed for 5 months on my trundle bed.
As one does.
As one does.
But that's like extremely, I mean, square footage wise, that's pretty tight quarters.
So what's so funny is I was doing some Q&A for this, and I couldn't remember what the square footage was, and I knew it was tiny. So I called the leasing company to ask them what was the square footage. Was it 300? And it's my old landlady on the other end. This is like 3 months ago. And she's like, that place couldn't have been more than 200 square feet. That's pushing it.
That's tiny. That's tiny.
She's like, did you even fit a bed in there? I was like, no, Elaine.
Yeah. Do you want to maybe
not have a full bed in there?
Reconsider your life choices as the landlord of a living space for somebody? That's essentially it sounds like a cell.
Yeah, it was. It looked like prison. I mean, it had bars on the window. It was very white walls, drab. So it was in the West Village, so obviously it wasn't prison. It was obviously like beautiful and gorgeous and one of my favorite apartments ever.
Well, I mean, it's a good neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And it's also the point of genesis for your novel.
Yes.
So it gave you that.
It did. It gave me so much. But that period was so high octane emotionally and so condensed that I didn't even think of it as it was happening as like material for something in the future. But then like 2019, I wanted to write a domestic novel. And I was like, that's going to be the domestic novel. I had enough distance from it.
Okay, so a couple questions. Mm-hmm. What was so high octane? Just the fact that you're with your sibling in this confined space, or were there other circumstances that you feel like contributed?
We were just on top of each other. We hadn't lived in the same space in a while, and it was just so cramped, and we were stepping on each other, and sort of like how crime rates go up in the summer when it's hot, like when you're in like a pressurized situation like that, just sort of everything becomes either amazing or unbearable.
Right.
And a lot of it was unbearable. And we were calling our mother, tattling on each other. I mean, we're in our 20s and we're doing this.
But I got to say, you're in your 20s, and I feel like people know this, but it doesn't get talked about enough. Mm-hmm. You're still a child when you're in your 20s, unless
absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, right? I mean, that still feels like youth, and so you don't really know who you are. You're not established. You're sort of trying to feel your way towards some kind of adult identity. You're usually broke, unless you're very fortunate. And so I remember my 20s that way. It's like, it was rough, and it wasn't necessarily, I mean, I guess there were some good times. It's, you are in like the prime of your adult youth, I guess. So there's that, you have that going for you, but there's a lot about it that is not pleasant.
Yeah. And it's hard because you feel so adult. You're the oldest you've ever been, and you feel I should be more prepared for life. And you're a child.
And you're a child. So you had this kind of like hothouse, very close quarters stretch of months where you're living with your sibling for the first time in a long time. And there's a lot of emotional intensity. which is captured beautifully in this book. I do have to say that some of the music of this book comedically is wonderful, and the back and forths and the dialogue is wonderful. And I really admire it because comic novels are not simple to get right. Mm-hmm. I feel like it's rare for a book to succeed in that way. And this one is consistently funny, but also has a ton of pathos in it. And when I talk to you now, you seem really chill. Are you on a sedative? Have you taken something?
I have started taking beta blockers for the first time in my life.
And?
Recently. It's amazing.
It helps?
I feel relaxed all the time.
Oh, good. Good. Maybe I should try one.
Highly recommend.
There is like this, I think, intimacy between siblings that anybody with siblings can recognize. Where, especially if you have a close relationship with your sibling, or maybe if you're close in age, that also can be a factor. But it's this interesting juxtaposition between candor and brutality and permanence. And then you add to that this unique set of circumstances where you're roommates in a very small space in your 20s. So you're out of the trappings of your childhood domestic situation, living with your parents, and you're both adults in quotes, and suddenly you're roommates again. But that feels like something that you were interested in exploring. It's a unique kind of relationship.
It is. My relationship with my younger sibling is like no other relationship in my life in terms of what you're talking about. Candor and brutality, and also being two souls who are really deeply entwined, but stuck together cosmically. Like you're along for the ride of life together without having had a choice in it. You know what I mean?
I think sometimes sibling relationships can rupture in a permanent way. But more often is the case, I think, that you just sort of resign yourself to the fact that you're stuck together.
Yeah. It's all out. It's not sort of like when you have a big fight with a friend or a big fight with a partner and you can kind of go, is this person going to walk out of my life forever? Because that person's not going to walk out of your life forever. Even if you cut off contact with them completely, they're still in the mix.
You're inextricable.
Completely.
And I think, too, we talk and emote oftentimes to and with our siblings in ways that we do not with anyone other than maybe a partner or a spouse. You might get to that point with a spouse or something, but siblings really get the kind of the rawest version of you, right?
Completely unfiltered. And sort of, I think with this book, I wanted to play with this kind of weird navigation of stakes we're talking about, where the stakes aren't a breakup. The stakes aren't leaving each other's lives. The stakes are just these people are going to say and do unimaginable things to each other, and then just kind of have to live with, I did that to this person. I said that to this person who I love, who my soul is entwined with.
And it's an awful thing to say, and it's an awful thing to do. And with literally anybody else on the planet, I couldn't get away with it.
But you can get away with it with a sibling.
Yeah.
Again,
it's like
and
this,
again and again.
And it's like this guaranteed, I guess you would call it forgiveness. Is that what you would call it? Like you're going to forgive each other for whatever. Like there's no, like you would really, like I'm trying to imagine what you would have to do. Like what kind of transgression would truly cross some sort of line.
It's forgiveness. And I think the reason that line is so different with siblings is because there's complete understanding, especially if you're siblings who grew up in the same household. I mean, sometimes siblings have a big age gap or they grow up at different times, but when you have been with someone every day of your life, forgiveness is not even the right. It's almost like there's nothing to forgive because you understand where every impulse this person has comes from and why they lash out. And you can make fun of the way in which they lash out because you've seen them like craft this way of lashing out for whatever, 20 years.
Well, you said also that you knew that you wanted to write a domestic novel. Why?
I wanted that compression of space. I think it's like a flame under the pot of your life when you live with someone. It's beautiful, but it's every day, all day. And it's different with a partner than living with a sibling. And you have some shades of this with a partner where your partner is your partner because they're the person you can say to, take the fucking trash out, please. But it's just not that. It's just so different. So I wanted to take those sort of things I was noticing after having lived with my sibling and then moving in with a partner and looking at those two different experiences and seeing how people who are living together drive each other crazy, but then are each other's refuge at the end of the day.
Yeah, I never doubted the love between Jules and Poppy over the course of this novel, no matter how intense the fighting got. Mm-hmm. And it often gets very intense in ways that are funny and recognizable. And I'm curious to know if you set out in an explicit way. You said, you wanted to write about sisters, mm-hmm. you wanted to write a domestic novel, and you wanted to write a comic novel. Did you want to write a funny book, or did the funny just sort of happen?
I wanted the book to be funny, certainly. And I wanted it to be funny in a highly specific way that when I sent pages to my sibling, they would find it funny. That they were the person that I was sort of writing the jokes for and writing these like funhouse mirror versions of situations we had been in or been through together. And so I think, it's an unbearable novel. I thought of it the whole time I was writing it as, it's so dark and so heavy. And to hear that it's being received as a comic novel is obviously it's very exciting. It makes me feel good. I've never thought of myself as funny as the funniest people in my life. So that's very exciting. But I think it is like a deeply bitter, kind of nihilistic, sad story. And the humor comes through because of that sort of assignment I gave myself to write really specifically for one person.
It's dark. Poppy, the younger sister who comes to live with Jules, as I think you mentioned earlier, is coming off of a suicide attempt. Mm-hmm. And that raises the stakes. And in particular, it binds them together more tightly, I think. Mm-hmm. Jules feels a sense of added responsibility to permit Poppy to live with her in her apartment. Mm-hmm. And it makes the prospect of parting company much more problematic and emotionally intense than it otherwise would be because of this concern over, well, what's going to happen to Poppy
if I'm not there?
If I'm not there.
Things from happening to Poppy, yeah.
And yet Jules, the beauty of this book too, is that while Jules feels this sense of sisterly protectiveness mm-hmm. for Poppy, Jules herself is in need of some protection too. So it's not just a one-way thing that's happening mm-hmm. where Jules is the bigger sister who's got her shit together, right. who's looking out for her kid sister. Both of them have some work to do. Yeah.
But I think that's the beauty of writing a character who's completely unself-aware, who has this narrative about themselves of, I'm the only thing standing between this person and the void. when like she's sort of a paper thin guardian between those two things.
It's a nice way to
yeah.
I was going to say it's a nice way to convince yourself that you have your shit together by telling yourself
someone who's doing worse than you.
Yes. And convincing yourself that you are that barrier. You know, you're the only thing, you know, between them and the void, essentially. And one of the things I noticed about this book as I was reading it and trying to kind of decode it is the specificity of it. It's a wonderfully observed novel that's very smart about the ways we live now. It's culturally astute. It's very astute when it comes to the internet and the way we live online and the way we are, in all of us, for the most part, in deep relationships, in deep toxic relationships with our phones, and how dominated we all are by the addiction to our devices and to the various apps and everything. And it also employs argumentation as a repeated device. I feel like so much of this novel is argument, and it's very funny. And you don't see, or at least I don't see, a ton of argument between characters, especially an argument that extends over pages of a book and gets into minutia and becomes absurd and circular and diverts and becomes about something totally unrelated to what it was originally about, and all the ways that human beings argue. Can you talk a little bit about that first? Because I have to believe you recognized it in the work as you were working on it.
Yeah. It is very circular in a lot of places in a way that I think that's rare in novels, because I don't want to say it's like having like a therapy scene or like someone talking about their dreams where sort of the unconscious is really like catapulted onto the page in a really easy way. But it is kind of that. And I think there's a really fine line between an argument whose goal is exposition and an argument whose goal is to just spiral and spiral and spiral and bring the characters to new places and get them off track and have them poke holes in one another's ideals, selves, etc. So a lot of the work of the novel was sort of building these really, I think there's a part where like, it's not an argument, but Poppy says something to Jules about like, did you know we could bite our fingers off, but there's something in our brains where we can't do it. And I had written that twice and was looking at like how circular my own thoughts were. And instead of erasing that and saying, oh, I'm so dumb, I wrote the same thing twice, thinking it was original, I was like, that's sort of how life is. And that's sort of how my conversations with my sibling are. Oh, did I tell you this thing from Tuesday? Yes, you told me that thing from Tuesday 5 times. And the way that we talk to our siblings or our close people or argue with them is so revealing about what's going on in our own heads. So I wanted it to have that sort of Samuel Beckett drama of two people sort of floating in space, only having each other to reflect themselves back at themselves. And I think that's why it's an argumentative novel.
Well, and then there's the parents, the mother character in particular. Is very funny. The parents live in Florida. The mother is like a pyramid scheme. She has like a pyramid scheme going with like essential oils.
She's always got a pyramid scheme going.
Yeah. And the father is a dermatologist who like provides his daughters with like microneedling and fillers and stuff. So it's great. It's a great comedic setup, but the mother and the way that she communicates with her daughters and the grievances that she consistently has. And there's something very funny about it. It's very like Larry David-esque. I kept thinking of Curb as I was reading this book, but it's like
He was born in the building where the book is set, in the Brooklyn Jewish Hospital. Yeah.
I was going to ask you,
because I kind of fated that he was going to ask me what. Yeah, sorry.
No. I because Richard Lewis just died.
I know.
The comedian who was Larry David's like BFF and was on Curb Your Enthusiasm in a consistent like supporting role. And so I think I was reading obits of Richard Lewis and summations of his life and work. And it was consistently noted that he and Larry were born in the same hospital 3 days apart. And it was a Jewish hospital in Brooklyn. And so when I was reading, that's now apartments. So I had that thought. I was like, I wonder if this is the place where Larry David and Richard Lewis were both born.
And I didn't find that out until, also like you 2 weeks ago or whatever. And that sort of felt like a very cool cosmic thing.
Yeah. So and you just why did you pick, did you think there is something funny about an apartment complex that used to be a hospital?
I mean, I live in it. It's like,
oh, you do?
My laundromat used to be the morgue. It's a very, people talk about it being haunted. I think it's mostly just the elevator doesn't work. But, there's those little motorized chairs that go up the stairs that haven't been used in 75 years. It's a creepy place.
And I guess it would be fair to say that Curb Your Enthusiasm is the kind of humor employed in it, and I think to some degree employed in your book. It's a very Jewish humor.
Yeah.
Like culturally, this is a very Jewish, this is a Jewish novel. It's about being Jewish, if not religiously, then definitely culturally.
Yeah. Seeing the world, against your will through this lens of, and it's so funny because, I'm not religious. I wasn't raised religiously. I didn't have a bat mitzvah. But over the course of my life, Jewish culture, Jewish humor has just realizing how huge and inextricable and like fully formed a part of me it is, has been really fun and interesting. And I think about like Curb, obviously, but A Serious Man, which is fantastic, sort of loose adaptation of the Book of Job by the Coen brothers.
Okay, I have to interject.
Okay,
I have something. I have a humble brag to make.
I would love.
I think I've even said this on this show before, but I went to the premiere of A Serious Man at the Toronto Film Festival because my wife was working a job there, so I tagged along. This is when we were. I don't even think we were married. We didn't have kids, that's for sure. But I went to Toronto, and she got me somehow a ticket to see the A Serious Man premiere. I sat right behind Tilda Swinton. Like she was right in front of me, the whole thing. And it was in this beautiful old theater. I'm terrible at like what the architecture was, but it was, you can picture it, right?
Yeah, I can picture it.
The movie plays. I am riveted. I think they could have played any movie and it would have seemed like Citizen Kane to me because I was sitting next to Tilda Swinton.
Right.
But it was also just like, so everyone was like so hyped up because it was the premiere and it was the Coen brothers and it was the film festival. And so it was this really receptive, juiced audience. But I remember when the closing scene of that movie with the storm coming, remember that? And then like the cuts to black and like the house lights start to come on. Standing ovation. I truly thought it was the greatest movie. I was like, this is it. This is like the new Citizen Kane.
It might be my favorite movie of all time. I rewatched it recently, and it's perfect. It's a perfect movie. It's so.
I think
fun. It's just what you're talking about this like innate Jewish humor that's really hard to describe. But the Goy's teeth section, where the dentist is talking about finding Hebrew inscriptions on the back of a non-Jewish patient's teeth and sort of being driven crazy. And in the end being like, yeah, I didn't figure it out. Life goes on. It's a miraculous movie.
There's a brutality to the humor. Something really sinister.
Has a brutal ending. It's a terrifying ending.
Yeah. I think it's often characterized in reviews as like maybe one of the most personal films the Coen brothers have ever made, because it's set in the Minneapolis suburbs where they were raised. And I think it sort of captures a lot about the milieu in which they grew up. And I think it is in their oeuvre, I think it might be one of the more underrated films.
I think so too.
And I'm interested to know that you love that film, because now I can draw a line between it and your book. Like there's similar vibes, right?
Well, it all stems from the Book of Job, which I had never read until graduate school. I was a teaching assistant in a class that was about the Book of Job in our culture and in our media, with a professor, Mark Larimore, who's sort of like he wrote the book on the Book of Job. And
is that what it's called? Is it called the book on the Book of Job?
It's called something I can't remember, but it's sort of like he is the Jobin scholar, I guess. And taking that class, really, I think it was sort of foundational. It's funny writing a book and you look back at the last however many years of your life, and you see the little things that at the time I wasn't thinking, I'm going to write a book that sort of has a character who has this baggage about she's Job. Everything in her life is wrong. Everything is a misery and a weight. But it's cool to look back and see, oh, that seed was planted there.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like novels, when they come together, I think you can typically look back on your life, and if not find all of it, you can find like the major threads, and you can sort of like pick them up and trace them back. I'm now thinking of The Room of String, but you know what I mean? Like there's an image in your book, The Room of String.
Rule. People are really seizing on this image, and I probably should have written a little something in the acknowledgments crediting Sarah Rule, the playwright. That's from her Eurydice, which is a really beautiful new version of the Orpheus myth. And I saw it as an opera a couple years ago, and the building of the Room of String was done so slowly in real time. And I had already written, I think I had finished the book, or I can't really remember in the timeline, but just seeing it happen sort of solidified like, oh, this is the metaphor for what they're doing for each other, even though they're bitching and fighting the whole time as they're doing it.
Well, the next thing I want to ask you about is the internet. I touched on it a bit ago, but we need to get into how smart this book is about online life and how well rendered like Jules's and Poppy's experience are and their mothers. I mean, everyone's online, right? And so these characters are very online, and we see it on the page. And I think from a craft perspective, this interests me, because as writers in the modern age, the internet is sort of unavoidable. Phones in the hands of characters, sort of unavoidable. And yet I think there is often resistance, and maybe I'm just projecting, but I think there is often resistance in writers to do too much of it, because there's something
right about that.
And I guess the question is why. Like in my mind, I'm thinking like, oh, this is annoying and superficial and hard to translate, and maybe it's not literary, and maybe it'll dumb my book down if the characters are constantly on their Instagram stories or whatever. And yet, how do you write honestly about people who are alive in modern times without depicting this stuff? And your book doesn't shy away at all. And I'm just curious to know, like, how you did it, choices that you made, like the decision to lean into it, like full bore, which is what it feels like. Like, were there things that you learned about writing online life in a novel of literary fiction, or in a novel of literary fiction, in a literary fiction novel? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, are there things that you learned about writing the internet that you can share?
Of course. I'm addicted to the internet in a really profound, bad way. And I think I was starting to notice that mid 2019. And So I wanted to do a domestic novel, but what I really, really wanted to do was an internet project. And I thought maybe I can do a book called Internet Book that's just this transcription of what I'm doing on the internet all day, every day. I'll like record my screen, or I'll, take a week off work and keep a notebook. And so I really had this profound desire to lean in, as you're saying, and like go to the wall with it. Because the inner monologue you have when you're scrolling is so dark and so destructive, especially if you're someone who, like me, does a lot of hate scrolling, hate searching old people from your life, seeking out corners of the internet that are really, just a raised field, barren devastation. So I just wanted to harness the power of narrative description. I think of a writer like Marilynne Robinson, who's a descriptive writer who creates these beautiful portraits of outfits, scenery, people. And I was like, I could probably do that for the internet. I could probably accept the risk of dating a book, or I guess I wasn't afraid of feeling like it wouldn't be literary to describe the internet, because I was like, if I do it closely enough and I go 100% and I don't half-ass it, it's going to look like something. It's not going to wind up being nothing. So that was a really conscious decision. As far as what I learned about how we use the internet,
nothing good.
Nothing good. I mean, that there's a part at the very end where it's just sort of Jules and her phone alone, and she can't even see half of what she's reading. But it's almost like, have you seen Shame, the Michael Fassbender movie? It's a horrible movie about sex addiction. And there's this great sort of horrible, the whole ending of the movie is him searching out trysts, and he's in pain, and the sex he's having is painful, and you can feel it in his body. And that's sort of like what the ending of this book is to me, that it's a compulsion. It's not something either of these characters enjoy, but it's something having a certain kind of mental illness, or not even like a formal mental illness, but being in a certain place in your head pushes you to that place of compulsively numbing out through the internet.
Yeah. I think we all have that feeling of inertia, or just like, what am I doing? And yet I can't stop doing it. It's addiction. It's exactly what addiction is. It's so awful.
I was with a friend the other night who's been off of social media for, I don't know, a year or something. And she's like, I have a life. When I'm making dinner, I'm just making dinner. When I'm at an art museum, I'm just at an art museum. I'm not taking a picture of the art thinking which one is most aesthetic, that people will like the most if I share it. And yeah, I want to inhabit my own life again, but I don't know how to quit the internet.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, I feel like I have an obligation to promote this show and share news of people's books. I have
that's the whole reason I feel like I'm on social media, is like attention and sharing my work, because otherwise, how do you know?
Well, I mean, it's like the only method of recourse available, and it's where people are, and it's like, feels kind of like it's like an obligation, or it's inescapable. But once you're in there, you're scrolling and you're checking. Yeah, once you're in, and it's not good for us.
And the internet's fun. Like, it's very fun to look up your lab partner from 9th grade biology and find that they're like a psycho spiritual guide who's selling workshops on how to love yourself, and watching all their videos for 2 hours. Like, that's very fun to me. And there's beauty in it. I don't know.
Well, I want to talk about something that I think is related, which has to do with the cultural critique that is sort of embedded into the novel. Like delineating things about the culture, criticizing things about the culture, or sometimes, to really great comic effect, just kind of like plainly stating things about the culture. Like there are moments in this book where you're just sort of saying things without offering any editorial on it. And that alone is funny. It works better that way. But it's a challenge, I think, that happens in contemporary fiction when the story is set in contemporary times, where you can have the author wanting to sort of vent about Instagram or Mormon mommies, which comes into play in the life of Jules. She's obsessed with these moms, like these, what are they called? Trad moms?
Trad wives.
Trad wives, that's right. And, you know, I think like that's just one example, but I think the danger is that there can be this kind of soapboxing effect that can happen where you start to feel like there's authorial intrusion. And as a reader, you're like, oh, so the author wants to let me know.
Right, that they're superior to this shitty adaptation of Medea they saw at BAM. Yeah.
Or it's like this, they want the character to sort of like be like a puppet voicing their politics or whatever it is. And I did not feel that way when I was reading your book.
Thank God.
Yeah, it felt organic. And so I think it's a useful, like, kind of crafty discussion to talk about how to avoid. Like, how did you do that? How do you get those things into the text without it feeling like, oh, here's Alex sort of, you know, trying to find a way to be angry on the page about like trad wife culture on Instagram or whatever it is, you know?
I don't know if I know the answer here. I think it's sort of bound up in this thing we're calling autofiction and supplying a book with someone who is you and not you. Someone who you can sort of filter your rage through and let them hang on to it and watch it warp them. So I think a lot of talking about my frustration with mommy bloggers or my frustration with, you know, finishing a movie and wanting to look it up on Reddit and see what other people are saying about it rather than sit with it yourself. I think, I don't know how to articulate it, I guess, that it had to be something that I could personally release in my life, but that would drive a very certain type of character absolutely up the wall.
Well, I mean, I think the word character might be the salient word, because maybe it really is just as simple as like effective characterization on the page makes it believable.
Because I think I am frustrated with mommy bloggers and you know, all the swirling morass around us every day, but I can sort of let it go. And I think having a character for whom those things feel like personal assaults somehow. I don't know.
Well, I feel like this is not a novel that was meticulously outlined. And I don't say that as a criticism. I just say that as an observation. There is a beautiful, intuitive feel to the plot progression.
Thank you.
And it feels like you just kind of felt your way from section to section and chapter to chapter of this book. Is that correct?
Yeah, I had a sort of loose, I guess I had another writer give me a phrase I really loved last week, a candy bag of sort of a document of things I knew that I wanted to include or write about or riff about. Little interactions I would have throughout my days, conversations I would have with my sibling or my parents or my partner, or, you know, anything that I felt I wanted to explore, I would sort of like list it. And I had sort of a loose structure of, I think this is going to take place over about a year. I think it actually wound up being like more like 8 or 9 months. But sort of what's going to happen each month in their lives. And just pulling from this list of little scenes I wanted to write, and then finding a way to arrange them that would add up to a plot, because I wasn't interested in sort of imposing. I have a bad habit in my writing of being like, this person attempted suicide a year ago, but that's not really important right now. What's important is like their trip to the grocery store.
Yeah.
And I'm sort of averse to these big, long, slow burn emotional things that I think we call plot. I'm much more interested in having that be the sort of fuzzy background and watching how it colors these sort of little moments of daily life.
Did you have a sense of an ending early on, or did you work your way to it?
No, I knew I was writing toward that ending, that specific scene. I had seen something like that in real life, and I had it in my head as something I wanted to write about. And when I started this project, I was like, oh, that's the ending. That's where they wind up.
I often hear that. I feel like it's good to have a sense of an ending, because then you have something to write toward,
right?
Even if you don't know how you're going to get there precisely.
Well, it's scary because I remember I wrote the book pretty chronologically, pretty much straight through, and getting to that last chapter and those last few pages and feeling like I was getting heart palpitations. Like, is it going to work? Is it going to fit? Or have I been writing toward this thing that is going to feel really wrong? And then it didn't.
Well, one of the things that struck me as I was reading it, and that I was wondering about in terms of how this book succeeds, comically. Is it comedically or comically? Comedically is comedian.
Either
comically,
or. I mean,
okay.
I don't know anything about grammar, syntax.
I feel like Jules, because Jules is asking herself questions like this. Like she's tortured by usage questions, which I could.
Yeah,
yes,
she really is.
Yeah, I could see a lot of myself in her. But like, as I said earlier, you seem pretty like quiet and not like demonstrably neurotic or anything. And yet on the page, I guess Jules is maybe a little bit more overt in that way. A lot of it's interior. Yeah. But as a writerly issue, in terms of achieving a comic effect on the page, did you intentionally take, and you also used the word autofiction earlier. So you're drawing from your life, you're basing characters on yourself and your sister. Do you then think to yourself, and I've got to ramp us up? Like I've got to, like you said, I think earlier in the conversation, you used the term funhouse mirror or funhouse. Like, is that part of what it takes to make really funny characters, is to kind of take ordinary people or grab pieces of people that and then amalgamate them, but then ratchet up the emotional intensity, ratchet up is that what you were doing?
I had a teacher in graduate school, a playwriting teacher, with whom I had a very contentious relationship. We did not get along. I did not like her and she did not like me. And she was always telling me, I've never had that in an academic setting before, but it was very intense. It was a small program, 4 people, very intense, and it was very palatable that she was frustrated with me sort of not pushing through. And I wrote about this in an essay a couple years ago, but she was always telling me, fantasize in the extreme. Let them go to extremes. Let your characters be huge. And I am kind of a quiet person, and I did think of myself as a quiet writer. And I was very intellectually resistant to that idea of making people larger than life, because I thought it would turn out like everyone was a clown. But with this book, I think it was taking that seed of, I know that I have this personality trait and my younger sibling has this personality trait. And what if we were unable to recognize those traits and work around them and apologize for them. And so I did push everyone to extremes. And I feel badly that I was probably so horrible to my playwriting teacher however many years ago, because now I think I owe her a large debt for having that in the back of my head.
It's a good lesson.
It is. Sometimes you got to eat shit and realize someone was right.
Yeah. Well, but I think also, especially if you're working, I mean, everybody's working from the stuff of their lives, but if you're working in an auto-fiction-y way, I think there can be an impulse to maintain a fidelity to the people who form the foundation of your characters. And what it sounds like you're saying is that you had to let go of that.
Yeah.
You had to.
It's so scary to drift away from life. I think I'm just so afraid of writing a scene or writing a situation where someone reads it and goes, that would never happen. That's not real. Because that's my frustration as a reader when I encounter something that feels manufactured. You know, of course they wound up on the same plane to Paris. Like, that would never happen. And I feel like it's impossible to, you know, guard your work and guard yourself on all sides and never fall victim to having something happen that wouldn't happen. But it's something I pay attention really closely to, probably often to my own detriment. And so I think relaxing that a little bit and saying, I'm going to pull from life so that I can't be disappointed in myself for creating something that would never happen. But I'm going to give it that extra push of fictionalization that makes it special.
It makes it funny.
Quotidian. Yeah. Yeah.
So you had to have been laughing as you were writing.
Probably.
Or at least smiling.
Yeah.
Maybe smiling.
Yeah. I had the sense, you know, after I wrote the first chapter of this, I rarely feel, as I'm writing, like proud in the moment or satisfied in the moment. And I was like, I think I have material here that I'm proud of and I'm satisfied with and I'm going to have fun with. And it was fun. It was fun to write.
Were there previous, it sounds like there were, I mean, just like for everybody, but there were previous novels or stories that you had tried to write that failed?
I had written a novel in graduate school and after graduate school that, I completed the manuscript. And I remember the day that I completed writing the first draft and like going for a walk with my mom. I was home at the time and just crying and being like, I know it's not good enough. I know it's not going to be my first book, even though I just spent 5 years writing it. And it wasn't. And this is my first book. So that like pain of finishing something and knowing that it's not quite what you can do and, you know, grieving it and then moving on and finding what it is you can do and learning lessons from it.
Is there anything from that failed manuscript that made its way into this book? Did you salvage anything from the wreckage?
I don't think anything specific, but it was very similar. It was about two sisters and a mother. And they had very different circumstances. And there was this sort of magical realism, mystical Florida quality to it that I think was very in vogue in like 2014, 2015. So it's still about, you know, triangulation and femininity and all of those things. The themes and the core of it is the same.
So I think you said you studied playwriting. Is that the course you took with this teacher? Was it a playwriting course?
Yeah, I did a year of graduate school in playwriting and then at the new school and then switched over to the fiction MFA. You
just decided you wanted to be writing books instead.
I had wanted to write plays my whole life from the time I was like in high school. That's what I thought I was going to do. It's what I studied in college. And I got to that first year of school and I was like, I can't hack it.
Why?
I can't work with actors. I can't work with directors. I couldn't take not having control and not having a product that was mine.
I had the same experience as a film student.
Interesting.
In undergrad,
How long
where they were like,
study?
I mean, I did it in undergrad. I have a film degree. I got the degree just because I didn't want to like change majors. I wanted to get out. I wanted to be done with school. I was like, ugh, just get me out of college.
I can't do this.
I mean, I was having fun in college, but I wasn't having fun at school.
Yeah.
But as soon as they were like, and now you've got to load the camera and make sure you have the right film speed and the lights. And I'm just like, okay, this is not my thing. I'm out. Yeah. I just want to tell stories. I don't want to like deal with gear.
Yeah.
But I want to ask you, because of those interests of yours, like playwriting, I think you've done some screenwriting. Or at least taken a stab at it. Is that right?
Yeah, I have.
Have you worked professionally as a screenwriter, or you just like tried to write screenplays?
I'm working on a little something right now.
An adaptation of your own book?
Yeah.
Okay. But this is something you're interested in, and I think that shows up as we discussed earlier in the dialogue. The dialogue in this book is excellent. You clearly have a gift for writing dialogue. But something that I couldn't help but notice, and this is also tied to my observation about the intuitive structure of this thing, if that's a way of putting it, the way that I could feel you feeling your way through the story towards an ending, but not in a conventionally plotty way, which I quite liked, is that this book works, and God, I might be misremembering. Are there chapters, or is it just...
There are chapters, yeah, but they're not numbered.
They're not numbered.
Like sections,
Okay. So this is what I'm working towards. Within the chapters, there are sections. So there'll be a section, and then we'll have like a, what do you call it? A page break, white space, a new section. What I couldn't help but notice was how beautifully structured each section was, and how almost always each section within each chapter built itself up to a very satisfying conclusion that usually involves some sort of comic callback. A callback is, to me, very much a filmic and like televisual device that I don't often see, or at least not as often in fiction. And yet your book employs it. It feels like pretty explicitly. Yeah. And it was just wonderful.
Well,
it was conscious.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wanted everything. Thank you. To add up. And I think sometimes chapters feel arbitrary. And so I had loosely structured everything episodically. And then when I went into edits with Emily Poulsen at Scribner, my incredible editor, her assignment was write the episode log line for each chapter to really sharpen it up and lock it into place and make sure that within every section you're doing that conscious work of making things add up. And so there was a lot of rearranging and moving around and like a lot of cutting stuff that was unnecessary and that I had written, oh, they should have a scene where they're doing this. And I had written a scene where they were doing whatever I thought they should be doing, and sort of trimming the fat and making sure that that sort of build was happening in each chapter.
That's really interesting and useful. And so I want to repeat it just so that I'm clear and so that people listening are clear. So for people who haven't had a chance to read, as we said, there are no numbers for the chapters, but there are chapters. And within each chapter, there are sections. Nothing unusual. This happens all the time in fiction. And what you're saying is that you would work on these sections. Each section tended to kind of end with this kind of callback or like some sort of comedic punch at the end.
Punchline, yeah.
And it must have been so satisfying. I was imagining it being satisfying. It would feel like it was clicking into place. Like that's how I experience it as a writer. It's like, you could probably feel like now it's done. I got it. Like I figured out.
One thing I can say about all of this.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I feel like it's like, now I know the puzzle pieces have clicked into place. But you had that, and you maybe had sections within chapters that you didn't necessarily need. And the weeding out process was catalyzed by your brilliant editor. What's her name again? Emily Poulsen?
Emily Poulsen, rock star angel.
Who suggested to you that you create a log line for each chapter. And just for people listening who might not be clear, a log line is essentially like a one-liner describing the story that you're trying to tell in a chapter. There's also log lines for film scripts. It's basically boiling a story down to one line or two or three lines, you know.
The little episode things you see on Netflix when you're scrolling, you know.
Right. Or TV Guide or whatever, if you're 100 years old. But you went through that creative exercise where you looked at each chapter and you created a log line for it. And then you set about reevaluating each section within that chapter to make sure that the sections were serving the log line.
The log line, that everything had a purpose and advanced the story. Because this really is, I mean, I did write it as a plotless novel. I think the plot really came to light throughout the editorial process because I had to sit and look and say, okay, so a lot is happening here, but what's actually happening here? And I think that's sort of when, you know, the Mother Wendy's plot line and her role became more consolidated. That's when the pieces of the internet, I don't know that they're sort of a one-to-one, but I think they kind of reflect where Jules is at emotionally, how much of the internet is on the page or what kind of piece of the internet is on the page at any given moment. So those things were sort of there and then became more intentional and more conscious through the editorial rearranging and that focused tight
and through
episode length.
And through the cutting.
Yes. I had to. I feel like I cut a lot and I put a lot back. Cutting is my favorite thing in the world, even more so now after this book. I love to cut.
I hear that a lot from people.
It's so satisfying. It's so freeing. I thought I needed this. I agonized over this scene for 3 hours, and it's better without it. That's an incredible feeling.
Yeah, it's also an incredible feeling to know you're doing away with something that does not serve the work. It's like, oh, thank God, I'm cleaning up the mess. You know, like,
because then you can see it pulls into relief. It teaches you as you do it. It's sort of a autodidactic process.
My favorite part of doing this show is cutting.
Yeah.
I cut out all the ums. I get rid of me asking me when I take like 2.5 minutes to ask a question. I'm just like, oh, thank God.
Oh my God, get to it.
Yes, get to it.
Yeah.
It's so satisfying to know that I've like saved myself. I didn't used to cut the way that I do now. So I live with the burden and ongoing horror of knowing that there are like hundreds of hours of me on tape, just being a jackass. But you know, it's the way life goes. So a couple of other things. These are just like minor observational asides that I want to tell you about. I don't even know if there's a question, but there's a couple things that I really admired that were very funny. First of all, there's a section in the book, and I'm never going to remember exactly where it is, where one of the characters, I think it's Jules, is probably just sort of talking about like political culture. And it like the paragraph is essentially just like a declarative list of like the right-wing fever swamp political culture, where it's like people believe that there's a cabal of pedophiles in the government who are, you know, funneling young children in, you know, through row houses on the Upper East Side. You know, like it's just like, it's actual shit that appears online and that lots and lots of people on the American political right believe to be true. And yet what I found so funny about it was how declarative that section was and how there was no commentary on the rightness or wrongness of this stuff. It was just like a laundry list. And like once you see it stacked up, you just realize how utterly batshit crazy it is. It's so obnoxious and so absurd that it's laugh out loud funny. And I think that the key craft lesson is that sometimes no commentary is necessary.
Yeah. You don't need to tell it. You just need to show it. You don't have to say anything about it. Yes. And I think I love that you picked up on this, because I think American politics American politics are very funny. We live in a ridiculous, horrible nation, and the hemming and hawing about how to be correct and how to be empathetic, and there's no place for that in politics. That's not what this nation is about. It's not about making a better world. And we're so humorless and so desperate for catharsis when we talk about politics. And it's funny. I don't know.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think, people want, I think everybody wants the moral high ground. Yeah. Maybe especially, not just especially on the left, but I see it there too, where people are always scrambling to claim the moral high ground. Mm-hmm. And there's something absurd.
I'm the rightest about this anyone has ever been.
Okay. So just this morning, mm-hmm. I was on Twitter, as I am, often am. Mm-hmm. And there's some guy, I'm going to forget what he said. Hang on a second. I think I texted it to my friend. But it's some guy who posts a photo of Beyonce. Mm-hmm. I guess it's maybe the album cover for her new Cowboy Carter. I'm not up on this, but you know what I'm saying? How she's got this new country album coming out.
Yes.
And she's on a white horse wearing red, white, and blue and holding an American flag. Mm-hmm. And this guy is saying, donning yourself in red, white, and blue and proudly waving this colonial imperialist flag, especially while the U.S. is actively responsible for ongoing genocides, ... Like it goes on from there.
Yeah.
And I was just like, okay. Like we all
everything has to be about, I'm right about the situation in the Middle East, and I'm going to show you how right I am by talking about it through Beyonce. It's
I see. It's and it's also like, man, this person is miserable. Is what I come away from it with, like people are so miserable. If you're fixated constantly on policing everybody's self-presentation and anything they say through this like incredibly intense moral lens, it just makes the environment hard to deal with, the online environment hard to deal with. So anyway, your book's great on that. And then I thought that it was just really smart and very funny to just sort of list it, to just declare it without, like you said, what is it? Show it, but don't tell it, or what did you say?
You don't have to say anything about it. Yeah, just lay it out.
The other thing that I noticed, I'm not going to get too into the weeds on it because it comes toward the end of the book, and I think that, the only way to really truly enjoy it is to read it. So we have that going for us. But there is a Thanksgiving dinner scene that gets political. That is so beautifully done on the page. I have to believe it feels like a comic crescendo in the book that I felt you having fun writing it. It must have been so satisfying to get that section right. I'm jealous of that section. It was like,
thank you. I'm still nervous about, I think anytime there's like a dinner scene, I think of the Fleabag, the season 2 opener dinner scene, which is remarkable. It's so funny. It's so brutal. And I think writing a scene where you're sort of like putting everyone together at the table and there's going to be, emotional bloodshed. I was nervous about it. So I'm very grateful to hear that it's funny.
It is also, I don't want to spoil. Maybe I'll issue a spoiler alert a little bit. Yeah. So if anybody wants to fast forward 15 seconds, but it's one of the funniest moments in the book. And you achieve the funny through juxtaposition. Like the section ends on this, like it's like the crescendo of this like tirade that Poppy goes on at the Thanksgiving dinner table politically. And then like the very next section begins with the father being like, so good to see you guys. I forget what it was.
Please
but like,
stay longer.
I felt you had to have laughed when you wrote that. I laughed out loud, which I almost never do when I'm reading. That was a very funny moment. And I was like, oh yeah, juxtaposition's good. Like you can really play with emotional intensity. And it's also very true to life. You can have these horrific experiences with your family. And then the next day at the airport, like your dad will be crying as he puts you back on the plane.
So much. Yeah. I mean, that's my experience of family is just, that emotional bloodshed and then, but you won't stay another week.
Right. No, actually not.
I
leaving. So I got to ask you, I mean, you're working from life. Like, do you have roots in Florida? Like, did you grow up there?
I grew up in South Florida in Parkland.
Oh, you did? Like where the Parkland High School was?
No one knew about it 6 years ago. I would say, I'm from Parkland, and people would go, where? And I would say, oh, Fort Lauderdale. And now everyone knows Parkland.
Did you go to Parkland High School?
I went to a private school nearby. I did not go to Stoneman Douglas, no. Yeah.
Oh, that's what I meant. Stoneman Douglas, okay.
But it's 5 minutes from, where I grew up. My brother went there. Yeah.
And as a child, and you have what, 2 siblings?
I have 1 younger sibling and 2 older brothers.
Oh my God,
brothers. Balloons.
God, where did those come from? So for people listening, we're on video, obviously, as we talk to one another, and balloons just started floating past my face for reasons which I
have no idea.
Yeah.
Sometimes that happens, though.
Sometimes in life.
If you do like a thumbs up, sometimes on Zoom, all the little thumbs will.
Oh, okay. Wonder what we said that caused the balloons. Siblings,
brothers. Congratulations on your older brothers.
So do you have any artistic parents, or like, do you have a lineage, like a genetic lineage that you're kind of feeling like you're a part of?
No, my father's a doctor. My mother runs his practice. Yeah, no one's my brothers. I have one brother who's a real estate developer and one who's a lawyer, and my younger sibling is in social work. My younger sibling is creative, though. They're a really deeply funny, artistic, sensitive person.
So what is the relationship with your family like into the work that you do? They must be mystified by it.
I was home a couple weeks ago, and it was for a shiva, for a funeral. And all weekend, my parents just kept pinching me, and they're like, this is book 2. Write everything down. So like my family's not any more insane than anyone else's family, but I think my parents, thank God, are very encouraging of me to write about our family. And my dad read the book this past week, and he was like, it's so beautiful to see all our stories in here. I love it. So, I'm lucky that that's their response to my sort of turning up the volume to 11 on the little things in our extended family.
You didn't ask permission?
No.
I didn't either.
My mom is not Wendy and my dad is not Steve. These are sort of caricatures and amalgamations of my parents with their friends and people we know and traits that I've invented. But they love seeing it. I don't know. I
hear sometimes people talk about, I think it's particularly in memoir, but it could also apply to autofiction, where it's like, I went to each person and made sure it was okay with them before I wrote or before I published. And I'm like, I don't know if you need to do that. That's problematic.
I just kind of wrote it. And when I sold the book, I showed them the manuscript and just kind of had a few anxious days of waiting for them to finish it and call me and say, what is this? This is what have you done? But they were really, I don't know.
So yeah, that's like my next thought is that, do we vet? Do we not vet? I have a very fatalistic view of all this. Like, we're all going to die. It doesn't matter. It's just a book.
It's just
what I always say, no one's going to read it anyway. Be like 20 people.
Exactly. That's what I've been telling myself.
Yeah. But I also think that most people, maybe not all, but most people actually like to see themselves reflected in the pages of a book, even if it's funhouse mirror or painful stuff.
What's funny now is sort of looking at like early reviews or, StoryGraph, Goodreads, whatever. And there's something very therapeutic and cathartic about having written issues in your own psyche or in the psyche of someone you love and seeing someone be like, this person's a nightmare. And like seeing it that way. Like someone wrote a review that was like, Jules is a bitch who needs therapy. And I'm like, okay, I should probably get into therapy.
You and me both. I haven't done it. I've been once. I went one time when I was like 20.
As a child, I was in therapy for whatever a year.
Yeah, maybe it's time to go back. I don't know.
Yeah,
I feel like
long overdue.
I'm reading books. I'm trying to meditate. I'm trying my best to stay well, but feels like a whole thing.
It's impossible.
It's also expensive. Like, I think I bristle. And I just yesterday was like having an existential crisis over how much health insurance costs for my family. But I bristle at this notion that like you're in dire straits and I am not in dire straits yet. There's always, I still have potential. But if you are in dire straits and you need therapy, this idea that, it's like, I'll talk to you and help you solve it for $200 an hour.
Yeah, there's something very I tried going to a therapist maybe a year ago, 2 years ago, and I just, they did this in Mrs. and Mrs. Smith, the TV show with Donald Glover and Maya Erskine that just came out. But Venmo code's on the door. And there's just something about, as I was Venmoing this woman who hadn't given me any advice and hadn't really even seemed to be listening to me that well, I was like, I can talk to myself about these things.
Yeah, I'll read a book. I'll listen to a podcast.
Yeah.
So I want to kind of come full circle to what you said at the very outset about writing this book for your sister.
Sibling.
Sorry.
It's
Am I using the wrong?
Okay.
I'm misgendering. I apologize.
That's all right.
Sibling. And it was basically wanting to please one reader. I've read about that before. I want to say Stephen King says that in On Writing, where it's like, just write to one person and try to please that person. And if you can please that person thoroughly, then you will please many people. But it seems like a wise creative strategy, first of all, is trying to please, especially maybe in a comic novel, trying to satisfy the sense of humor of one individual whose sense of humor so well, right? So you can be a fairly accurate judge, I think, in that scenario as to whether or not the jokes will land.
Yeah.
But I also think that it's a very like loving gesture to write a book to a sibling, especially like a funny book, and trying to like make that person laugh. And I think it's just a useful thing to remember. It's a way of narrowing down the process and making it more manageable.
Yeah.
And it's also a way of evaluating the work with accuracy. It's a much bigger project to try to make something that's going to generate laughs in a big, huge audience.
Yeah.
Versus like,
I would never try stand-up because it's so broad. It's so love me. Whereas I think the best humor is really specific humor. A joke you share with one person, your best friend, your sibling, your partner.
Well, but then I think it's also it's tied to this kind of conversation that I often have on this show about universality in art and how aiming for universality is a fool's errand.
Yeah, you'll fall on your face. You have to be specific to unlock the universal. I don't know how it works, but and I've heard a lot of people talking, I feel like Sloane Crosley was just talking about this on something I was listening to, that the more specific and granular you get about your own worst thoughts or the worst thing you've ever seen. Now, I don't know why I'm talking about this as if it only works when you're doing bad things, but getting so specific about the texture of your life and your thoughts, there's this like alchemical thing that happens where all of a sudden people can access it. Whereas if you try to write something, you know, I'm going to write a book that will sell, or I'm going to write a book that 50,000 people are going to read, it's never going to accomplish that for you. It's going to feel manufactured. It's going to feel false.
So the cover of your novel, it's a good cover.
Mm-hmm.
You got to love it.
I look at it all the time and just can't believe it's mine. It's perfect.
Where did you get that painting? Where, like, can you talk about, because for people listening who cannot see the book, can you describe the cover?
Yeah, it's there's a brunette in a striped shirt who's sort of flopped over with her head in her arms, and she's got a big bowl of fruit resting on her head, and she's looking out at the ocean, and the word worry in this like diabolical bright red shade is pressing down on her.
So it's like a still life.
Yeah.
It looks like a traditional oil painting of like a still life, except that the bowl of fruit is resting on a woman's head, who's like, you know how when you were in class in like junior high and you fell asleep, you would sort of fall asleep on your desk with your head in yours. It's like she's doing sitting. That.
Yes.
Yeah. But with a bowl of fruit on her head. And this word worry, the title of your novel, I was kind of admiring it as I was going, because to me, it's not like it's not the easiest book to title.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily like, it's not like obvious, like, oh yeah, you would call this book Worry. Some books have like a title where it's like, of course, you know. Of course,
yeah.
But it's the right title for this book. And I think that it's almost like it directs the reader in a certain way to like the deepest core of these characters, but also the cultural concerns of this novel, which can feel like there's something ineffable about the word worry. Like, worried about what? And what does that actually mean? And how does
nebulous.
But it's so pervasive too. Like,
I think
maybe
once I found the title, I feel like it's pervasive throughout the book, because maybe halfway through the writing of it, I found it, and it really directed everything for me. It became this container.
Yeah, it focuses it. Like every exchange, every concern, every dissatisfaction has within it a current of anxiety. That's where a lot of the comedy comes from. It's where a lot of the pathos comes from. It's what our online behavior is often wrapped around. And it's so recognizable and human. I guess a question that I have as I think about it is how normal it is. Like, are the times we're living in, and I think maybe this is a question that this book sort of silently poses, is like, are the times that we live in creating more anxiety in us than previous human societies have had to grapple with? It sure seems like it.
I think so. I think it's the saturation. It's every moment. It's, you know, we're at this place where, you know, it is very dystopian that our release is our little phones, our little devices. That's what most people do at the end of the night. Get in bed and watch TikTok or check Twitter. Even if you have to put on a meditation app or like a white noise app to sort of relax yourself, you're doing it through this brick that's kind of beaming the collective consciousness of the world at you. And what I like about titling the book Worry is that there's that like worrying something in your hands, you know, that it's this repetitious act that wears something down. And it's what Jules and Poppy are doing to each other. It's what the internet is doing to them. It's what their mother's doing to them. It's very active. And I like that it's one word. It's just declarative. It's big.
When did it come to you?
It does permeate. I found this tertiary definition of the word worry that comes from like old Middle Dutch Germanic something that is to slay or injure or bite something as a dog or a wolf does and shake it around. And so once I saw that, maybe about halfway through the book, and I had the ending that we won't talk about in mind, that was the moment that I was like, okay, it's not going to be like the slackers. It's not going to be something I have to search for. It's right here. It unifies everything.
That's like I call those creative synchronicities. Mm-hmm. It's confirming when that sort of stuff happens, and thrilling. I love when that stuff happens. It felt like it fell
out of the sky. Yeah, I was just looking on my phone one day and someone had posted it somewhere. Don't remember where.
Meant to be. Mm-hmm. So in terms of next projects, are you working on another book?
I'm working on something new right now. Yeah, another novel.
Any hints as to what it's about?
It's a relationship novel, and I think it's going to retain new characters, new everything, but I think it's going to retain a lot of what I learned to do through writing worry, which was just attuning yourself to the minutia of a moment or the minutia of a relationship and sort of pulling the unconscious up into the conscious.
Okay. And then the screenplay. This book has been optioned for the screen. Worry has been optioned for the screen.
It has been optioned for the screen. I can't really talk about it very widely.
What is it with Hollywood? Nobody can talk about Hollywood.
Nobody can talk. It's, but I'm working on that.
Can I ask? Is it a feature film adaptation or a television
series? So I've just written one episode with my writing partner, and we're sort of in limbo. We'll see. I mean, it's new. Like we just finished last week, 2 weeks ago.
Limited series, or is the idea that you're going to like kind of extrapolate this novel into like a whole?
No idea yet. Yeah, I don't know.
Okay.
I really don't.
Well, you're well suited, I think, to writing for the screen with your ability to do funny dialogue, and I will look forward to it. I hope it makes it all the way through whatever hoops a thing has to make it through to get itself.
So many hoops.
So many hoops. It's a maddening and insane business, but it's been a joy to meet you and to talk with you. Congratulations on Worry, and best of luck to you on whatever comes next.
Thanks so much, Brad.